Christy Marie's Own Double Entry is a novel by the experimental British writer Brian Stanley Johnson, and it's centered around a young man named Christy who embarks on a series of terrorist attacks to basically get back at society for not giving socialism a chance. So, understandably, most literary critics who have discussed this novel have tended to focus on the challenge it poses to capitalist ideology. But as a result, the gender politics of Johnson's text and the extent to which it also reflects on patriarchal ideology has been massively overlooked. Now, the first time I read this novel, what really struck me was the way the female characters were depicted. And I was kind of unsure whether it was shamelessly misogynistic or feminist in some kind of roundabout way. So, in this presentation, what I want to argue is that it would be really productive to look at this novel as a work of feminist metafiction, because it uses male-centric representations to ask very important questions about the kinds of roles we ascribe to women in fiction as well as in reality. So first things first, what do I even mean by feminist metafiction? This is Jessica Rabbit from the 1988 film Who Framed Roger Rabbit. And Jessica Rabbit has been described as both a pure product of the male gaze and a feminist icon. And the reason she can be both, the reason she's able to hold that contradiction, is because she's an example of parody as a doubly coded mode, as something that both legitimizes and subverts the thing it parodies. So Jessica Rabbit is both legitimately objectified within her narrative and a commentary on objectification. And this is a commentary that operates through the use of metafiction. So Jessica Rabbit has this very iconic line, "I'm not bad, I'm just drawn that way." What she's doing here is that she's reminding us that she's a cartoon, that she's a fictional character, that she's constructed, and crucially, that she's constructed in a sexually suggestive manner. So this is a piece of fiction that is drawing our attention to the sexual and the gender politics of fictional representations. That's metafiction. But the thing about that line that makes it so interesting is that you can also interpret it in a non-metafictional way. You could say that here drawn means attracted, that what Jessica Rabbit is saying is that in spite of her better self, she's naturally attracted to sexually suggestive behavior. And this is a reading that tends to reinforce the stereotype of the femme fatale that Jessica Rabbit embodies, that tends to legitimize instead of subvert, which is what the metafictional reading does, because it foregrounds the constructed nature of the representation. So this kind of parody and this kind of metafiction lends itself to both subversive readings and, let's say, conservative readings. And that is really important to Johnson's oeuvre because he uses metafiction in a really similar way. The characters in Johnson's novel are all aware that there are characters in a novel, and like Jessica Rabbit, they make references to their own fictionality. And there is this narrator who fashions himself as an author and functions basically as an intervening god who moves things around in the narratives, who creates and kills off characters at will. And at some point he says, nothing happens by accident in this novel, not even the commodification and the marginalization of the female characters. So this is a narrator who is very explicit about the fact that the subordination of women in his novel is a storytelling choice, it's a construction. And this becomes very apparent early on in the novel with Christy's mother, who basically comes in and delivers this very theatrical speech in which she announces her imminent death. She says, "I have, for the purposes of this novel, been your mother." And now that Christy is all grown up, that she has fulfilled her narrative function, she has become obsolete, and so she's killed off. This is a parodic literalization of maternal self-abnegation. This is a character who in the story literally exists only for her son. Once her son no longer needs her, the story no longer needs her. So you see that parodic element where it is one thing, but it's also a commentary on the thing. Here, a commentary on the way we tend to depict women as only in relations to the men around them. And the narrator of Christy Marie's Own Double Entry is very explicit about the fact that he uses women as narrative commodities, and it's even more apparent with the Shrike. So at some point, both Christy and the narrator come to the conclusion that to really focus on his terrorist plot, his great idea, Christie needs some kind of sexual outlet, so the narrator creates a girlfriend for him. Chapter 6 of the novel is called The Shrike Created. The shrike is the name of a bird, and it's also the name that ends up being arbitrarily given to the girlfriend. The fact that she doesn't have a proper name is simply indicative of the fact that the narrator doesn't think it's really important. Because what's important about the shrike is that she adores Christie. It's ridiculous how much she adores him. She spends her time trying to find ways of making herself more sexually available to him. Her greatest aspiration in life is to devote herself fully to Christie. What she is, ultimately, is a plot convenience. Her existence within the narrative is there to resolve a dilemma within the male narrative. And this is something the narrator emphasizes even further with this irreverent telling of the Genesis, in which God, like certain kinds of novelists, is an improvident maker. Suddenly realizes that he's given 3 sons to Adam and Eve, and that he needs to create women so that the men can reproduce and carry on God's plan for humanity. So you really see that parallel between our narrator and God, between God's plan and Christie's great idea, which are both male-centered plots that use women, and crucially women's sexuality, as plot conveniences to the resolution of masculine dilemmas. And what Johnson is doing here is that he's inviting us to enter canonical text from a new critical direction, with an eye to the way in which they commodify women. But the thing about it is a mirror goes both ways. So as he points to the Genesis and to the tradition of male-centered narratives, he's also basically implicating himself within the structures of patriarchal discourse that he's commenting on, because he's doing the exact same thing with the female characters. So, as you can see, Johnson is really not subtle about his use of metafiction. It's very in your face, which makes it so baffling that literary critics, whenever they have discussed the female characters, have completely overlooked the metafictional element. You get a lot of readings like this by Sam McKinstry, who here says that the shrike has an alienated quality of existence that is offset by a fecund and uninhibited sex life, and that this is a challenge that the narrative makes to the docile sexuality of bourgeois marriage, which is an interesting interpretation, but it completely overlooks the gender and sexual politics of the text. The shrike is alienated in her existence because there is simply no provision within the male-centric narrative for her autonomous existence. And to naturalize the shrike's sexuality is a failure to engage with those politics of representation. And McKinstry is by no means the only one who does this. Philip Tew, for instance, says that in general, the sexual commodification of women throughout Johnson's oeuvre is representative of the commodification of people within capitalist society more broadly, which, again, interesting, entirely fails to see the point when it comes to the specificity of gender. But, however frustrated I get with these kinds of interpretation, I have to reckon that they are made possible by the text itself. Johnson's use of parody legitimizes these kinds of conservative interpretations. There is something within the text that makes it possible. Which brings me to my conclusion. The fact that postmodern artworks like Christie Maury's own Double Entry and Who Framed Roger Rabbit use metafiction and parody in a way that implicates them within the structures of discourse that they critique, which makes them complicit with those structures of discourse, which means that they are politically limited. You've seen the kinds of interpretations that they invite. But it also gives them the unique opportunity of being able to undermine structures of power from within them, which is not insignificant. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's not necessarily very useful to try to think of Johnson as a misogynist or as a feminist. I don't think you can categorize him either way unproblematically. But there is something that I think is very valuable in the way he teaches us that fictional representations are political and that patriarchy fundamentally is reliant on fiction. Thank you.